Hey guys, Mr. P. In this video, we're going to talk about variation as a feature of life. So what are the variations that exist within different levels of organization? In our past videos, we've talked about taxonomy and we've talked about levels of organization. And so now we're going to kind of dive into the levels of organization in order to identify areas of variation and appreciate that variation is a feature of life and that it's fundamental and vital to sustaining life. So there are a variety of organizational levels on this screen. We have the organism level, we have a population level, and we have a community level. Now remember from our previous videos that we said an organism is any biological system that functions as an individual life form. So that's a species. That would be an individual that has a certain set of distinguishing characteristics. When you put a specific organism together with other members of the same species, then you get a population, which is a group of organisms of the same species in the same place at the same time. And then you put that population into an area with populations of other organisms and you get a community, which is a populations of two or more different species occupying the same geographical area at the same time. You can see that there is in fact variation among individuals of the same species, meaning not all zebras within a population are the same. In fact, all of them are different. When you look at a community, then obviously greater variation exists among members of different species. The giraffe is substantially different looking than the zebra, and the zebra is substantially different looking than these ostriches in the background. So there is a tremendous amount of variation that exists among members of different species, but there's even a set amount of variation that exists among members of the same species when they're in the same place at the same time. Variation exists among members of the same species. I kind of just alluded to that. You might not have actually studied the markings of a zebra very carefully, but if you look at the 4 zebras that are on this screen, at least right now, you'll see that if you look closely, there is in fact a substantial amount of difference among the stripe patterns of these 4 animals. For instance, this one in the middle has some really thick bands on its neck, whereas the other 3 do not. A lot of these other ones have stripes that split in certain areas, and these and certain ones do not. So there is in fact variation that exists among members of the same species. Variation is a defining feature of life and refers to the differences between members of a group. Variation can be discrete or continuous, and we'll talk about what those are in a minute. But if we focus on the zebra, there are 2 different groups, and there's actually more of them than just 2, but we're going to focus on 2 for the purposes of this discussion. There is a mountain zebra, which lives in the more arid, rugged, mountainous regions. And then there's a Grevy zebra, which is more of the plains zebra. The mountain zebra has a thick flank. It has very thick stripes on the flank, and they point downward when they hit the belly. So there are no underbelly stripes, and you can see that all the stripes here are going to point down when they hit the belly. There's a dewlap on the throat of the mountain zebra. And on the back end, there's zigzag stripes that cross the back and get small toward the tail, and there are these really thick rump stripes as well. That is the variation that exists on this particular species. If we look at or compare it to this species, which is the same type of animal, they're both zebras. The Grevy zebra has very large ears. It has very thin stripes, no stripes under the belly. So they are the same in that they don't have belly stripes. But this zebra has very thin stripes, whereas this zebra has very thick stripes. The Grevy zebra has a triangular pattern of stripes on the flank. Remember up here, there was thick flank stripes. However, on the Grevy zebra, there is a very thin set of stripes, and they actually form this kind of triangular pattern. And if you look at the back end of the Grevy zebra, you'll actually see that they don't terminate at the back end with these thick stripes. They are continually small, okay? They stay small throughout the full body of the Grevy zebra, but they are actually going to kind of continue on around and actually can connect in some places on the back end. So there is some variation that we just focused on within 2 different groups of zebras. When we talk about discrete variation, that is talking about the traits that can be put into distinct qualitative categories. So if it is a trait that has specific categories, and there are a lot of people within the same category, or a lot of animals within the same category, it is a discrete form of variation, or an example of discrete variation. The cause of discrete variation is usually influenced by one or a few genes. Typically, it is one gene. And examples of these types of traits would be hand used for writing. So whether you're left-handed or right-handed, the reason that is a discrete variation is because we have people that are in the left-handed category and right-handed category. You're either left-handed or you're right, or you're special and you're ambidextrous. Snapdragon petal color would be an example of discrete variation because there are discrete categories. There are red petals, white petals, and pink petals. Blood type, you have blood type A, B, AB, and O. So that again is a discrete groupings of people that fit within those particular categories. Hitchhiker's thumb, whether it's present or not, that is a discrete form of variation. Tongue rolling, whether you can do it or not, that is a discrete form of variation. And then P-shape, smooth or wrinkled. Whether the P's are smooth or whether they're wrinkled, again, distinct categories that you can group organisms into. This is a particular bar graph that will show, in this case, patient blood types. Again, blood typing was a form of discrete variation, and that's because we can literally put people into categories. These people are blood type A. These people are blood type B. These people are blood type AB, and these people would be blood type O. When we compare that to continuous variation, you will notice that in this case, there are traits that vary along a qualitative or quantitative continuum. Most types of biological variation are continuous, meaning there is a greater variation that exists, and that variation is continuous, meaning there is a greater amount of differences between the people or the organisms that are exhibiting that trait. Continuous variation is the result from complex interaction between many different genes, so we call those polygenic traits, often with the environment playing a significant part in the expression of the phenotype. Some examples of continuous variation would be height. That could be human height. That could also be animal height. Body mass, skin tone, root length in plants, also leaf length. Anything that typically has to do with growing or growing rates or growing size or growth size or body mass is going to have a distribution that follows this typical bell curve, meaning we have an average body type. Okay, in this case, we are graphing human height, so this would be our average height, 150 to 154 centimeters. But there are people that exist under 154 centimeters, and there are people that are over 154 centimeters. As we go down these bands, we can group people into these categories, but you might even have further continuous variation within these categories, because you might have somebody at 145 and a quarter centimeters. You might have somebody at 145 and a half centimeters. So individuals in this particular histogram can reside in a variety of these different categories, and there is a tremendous amount of variation that exists within this continuous variation form of variation. Variation exists at every level of biology, and so if we talk about the levels of biology and where variation exists, you can see that if we start at the molecular level, which is DNA in this case, you can see that there are three individual very short sequences of DNA. In this case, there is a SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism. There is one area in these three people's tiny section of genome that is different among all three of these individuals. Well, that's variation. This A in this particular area might exhibit a slightly different trait than the G in this particular area. And those might be a slightly different form of the trait than the individual that has a T in that particular area. So again, at the molecular level, you can see that there are differences among the DNA sequencing of these three people at this one single nucleotide polymorphism. At the cellular level, again going up one level from molecular to cellular, you can see that there are a variety of cells. We're not going to talk too much about stem cells in this class, but stem cells are undifferentiated cells, which means they have the ability to differentiate and become specialized. These stem cells will produce other forms of cells, and if you look, these muscle cells, blood cells, neurons, liver cells, intestinal cells, all of these cells are going to look different because they're going to function different. Well, that's variation. Variation exists at the cellular level, and we are the direct result of the variation that exists at that level. The fact that we have muscle cells that look the way they do and behave the way they do allows us as the organism to utilize those to move objects and to move ourselves. If we go up one level to the organism level, again, this is obviously very simple to see the variation that exists among different organisms on the planet. And then at the ecosystem level, you just need to travel to different parts of the world and you will see that there are different ecosystems around the world based on different abiotic and biotic factors. Again, that's variation. So this is variation kind of to the planet. This would be variation among organisms. This is variation among cells. And there is variation among molecules. Variation within a species, again, if we focus on these zebras, you can see just on the faces of these three animals, there is a high amount of variation that exists within these individuals. And so variation within a species is called intraspecies variation, meaning species have variation, or it could loosely translate to variation within a species. These are all individuals within the same species, but you can see that there is a substantial amount of variation that exists among these four individuals. Genetic variation within a species is inheritable, meaning transmitted from parents to offspring. And genetic variation in a population of organisms enables some organisms to survive better than others in the environment in which they live. That results in increased survival and higher reproductive success, which is the basis of natural selection, and that leads to evolution. We'll talk in depth about evolution when we get to the evolution part of this class, but for now, if you understand that genetic variation results from sexual reproduction, which leads to higher reproductive and fitness levels, which leads to natural selection, or nature favoring those individual organisms, which leads to evolution as a whole. So some more variation within a species, again, mutations at the molecular level. So again, this would be a molecular form of variation. We can mutate different sections of DNA, which would result in different traits. If we change the DNA at the molecular level, it will have a manifested effect of changing the protein that is produced and therefore changing the way the protein is expressed. If we change the way the protein is expressed, we're going to change the way that the trait is observed. Meiosis, this is a cellular form of variation, but based on the way the chromosomes assort, it's called independent assortment. We also can talk about crossing over, which you can see these chromosomes are actually exchanging sections of DNA. That can result within the cellular level of increased variation within a species. At the organism level, again, sexual reproduction leads to an egg and sperm cells joining to form a fertilized zygote, which is going to produce an embryo of that particular organism. Because we are reproducing or fertilizing an egg cell with sperm cells that don't ever or have never been joined, we're going to produce different combinations of genes, which is going to result in different genome or different DNA sequencing, which gives rise to different organisms and therefore different traits. And then if we go to ecosystems, we can talk about gene flow. That would be a population of organisms that might have a particular allele variant, which might have been completely cut off from population 2 with a second allele variant. Well, if we open up a pass to allow the population 1 organisms to migrate to the population 2 organisms, then we start shuffling these alleles and we can start mixing them, and we will therefore increase the variation within those species. So as we wrap up our discussion about variation between and among species, we again reiterate that there is a substantial amount of variation, whether it's readily observable or not. There is a ton of variation that exists among members of the same species. And there is an even greater amount of variation that exists among members of different species. Again, you can see that there are a variety of different communities in this particular picture. All of those individual organisms possess traits that make them unique to that particular species, but they all look and differ in terms of the traits that they possess. Obviously, all of these are in the class Mammalia. However, if you notice, there is an ostrich in the middle of this that is obviously not a mammal, and so it does share a lot of taxonomy groups with the mammals. In fact, it shares the same domain, kingdom and phylum. The ostrich, as well as other birds, are eukaryotes, animals, and they have a backbone. But when you get down into the class, they would be the aves, whereas the rest of the organisms on this screen would be mammals. Domain bacteria is a different domain that would differentiate these particular single-celled organisms from the rest of the organisms on the screen. And you can see that as you go away from or get less related, the variation that exists among the organisms differs or increases. There is greater variation among mammals to birds, and there is even greater variation among the bacteria to mammals and birds. As you go farther and farther in terms of your relatedness from each other, the variation is going to increase. Individuals within the same species will have less variation than those classified as different species. The largest amount of variation would be between organisms classified into different domains, like bacteria and the rest of the eukaryotes. Eukaryotes meaning they contain a nucleus within the cell and it creates multicellularity, whereas the domain for bacteria do not possess nuclei in their cells and cannot possess multicellular organisms. That's it for this particular video. If you learned something, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. See ya.